Okay, so now that you know some particles, let's go ahead and put one into place. Load up the Sync02 from the content folder and then resave it as Sync03. From there, go over to Setup, Particles, Radial Emitter. Shift A will fit it to view, and let's press O, and let's turn off texture locators if they are on. What those are showing the textures within the image. And I believe I showed this earlier in the course, but if I didn't, what you can do with those. They actually seem more annoying for a lot of people than useful, but they are actually quite useful because if you go into your texture groups, you can see them right here. And if you select one of them, press such as like the W key, you can actually move the textures around in real time and see them visually. So those texture locators work really well, but they often get in the way. So O key, texture locators, turn those off. From there, let's go ahead and get this particle going. So we've got our counter and our sync, right? And I'm going to change this to a default view so we can see things a little bit better. We'll zoom in and let's go ahead into our setup, select the radial emitter, and we are going to bring the angle down to about 20 degrees. And I'll hit this little play button here so we can see the particles. That's good. What we want to do instead now is press Y or the E key for rotate, and we're going to rotate this 180 degrees. We can type it in manually over here on the right. And then Control Space, get to a right view, and we can move that up and position it, and Control Space to a front view. And let's go ahead and pull that in like that. And I'll zoom in to show my particles a little bit better right there. Okay, so perspective view again, and move this. And then we finally just kind of move it up. So there are particles coming out of the faucet. And you can decide how you want this to look. I'm going to do mine as a little bit more of a stream. So first thing I'm going to do is change my emission rate to about 450, just so we have a nice flow. And then going back to, let's close this texture group up to keep organized. Here's a radial emitter. Transform is fine. The velocity, I'm going to bring that down just a little bit. A little softer flow. Now be careful there that I'm getting a little push over there. They're falling. So let's work with the speed here real quick. There we go. So basically what had happened there is because my initial velocity went down, they were actually shooting out a little bit the other direction. So I had to bring my velocity spread down as well. And then we're going to change the cone angle down just a little bit more. And I'm going to increase my angle spread. So there's a few parts of the particles, I should say, coming out. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and take that sync and make that dynamic, just like I showed you. So Control Space or Command Space to save this thing. Let's select the sync. We're going to go to Dynamics. It's going to be a static rigid body. And if you remember, we're going to take all of these. You don't have to, but this just visually helps you. You can put them in the schematic view. And these are connected. Here's the solver. And when you get a little triangle like this, remember, double click and that will open up. So you get those. So all you need now, in order for this to interact, to make those particles bounce around, okay, all we need to do is then go back to particles and add a dynamic collider, like that. And now our particles are colliding with that sync. From there, we can put a little bit of gravity on. Let's take the collider and put it in here so you can see what's happening. Okay, and we'll go back to simulation. Use gravity. Start, stop. There we go. So now we've got nice faucet, but it's just kind of pulling up right there. Okay, I know my sink doesn't do that, so let's select the dynamic and let's pull the friction down to 0. There we go. All right, so here's what's happening. Notice that now it's not sticking in that one part, but it's almost like it's running on an invisible plane, right? What's going on there? Well, that has to do with the dynamic and the way the calculation is set up. So let's select the sync again. Go to dynamic, and the type is rigid, but the collision shape is multi-hull. If you choose one of the others, like hull, you'll see that suddenly changes everything. See that? Okay. So if you do it as a sphere, you're going to see these things kind of, they're actually up here, they're going to round off. Okay. So this sink, the way it's colliding, actually has sort of an invisible force field, right? So in this case, I just want to choose mesh. It might take a little bit longer to calculate, but it's going to be a little bit more accurate too. And then we can play with some of the other variables. So we're going to change the bounce and pull that all the way down. And then from there, let's pull the margin down to about 5 millimeters. And let's go back here to the radial emitter, control space to a right view. There we go. So now you can see all the particles pulling up. Okay. Now they're still kind of crazy, right? So let's go ahead and fix that. So what I'm going to do first is go back here to particle simulation. Go to particle simulation there, and let's bring the gravity down to like -2. All right, so that helps right there. But now you can see almost like it's falling over too soon. All right, so first thing I want to do is take this radial emitter and I want to pull it down just a little bit. So that's number one. See, it's colliding with the top of the faucet here. So we want to pull that down just a little bit. The other thing I can do, if this really becomes a problem, make the sink itself dynamic and then take this faucet and pull that off there and turn off any dynamics for that. Right now it's all one object, so that's a big part of it too. But I think we can go ahead and enhance this just a little bit because it's working pretty well. So what I want to do then is, see that, can you see that bump right there? Like it's not hitting. It's actually just starting to separate too soon. So let's go back up to the sink itself under dynamics. And then I want to take this margin down to 1 millimeter. And now look what happens. Now it just kind of hits and rolls right off. Okay, so that margin sort of acts like, well, like a force field. So if you end up having an object and the particles are kind of blowing through it, you can increase the margin a bit, and that just kind of expands the dynamic range of where that collision's happening. See, so I just brought it back up, and now the collision's happening a little bit sooner. So let's bring it back down like 2 millimeters just so we don't go through it. There we go. And now the water's kind of running and running around there. So I'm going to save that scene. Let's go ahead and put on blobs. Blob. And then for the blob, I'm going to choose particle simulation. Let's go ahead and calculate. And then we'll hit the play button. And we got some gigantic blobs. So let's go ahead and fix that. Those are entirely too large. Be careful now going over to the render window and hitting play, because that will definitely slow down your system, might even crash it. I just brought it down to 20 millimeters instead of 500 millimeters. And now we can go over to render, take a look at this, see how it's looking. Much better. Okay, I'm going to turn off the counter for the time being just to save a little room. No, it's about the same. So this slow render is really just all about these blobs being calculated. But I'm going to bring these maybe even smaller, 10 millimeters. And let's stretch the particles about 100%. And let's choose maybe a 200% random size, maybe a little bit bigger on here. The radius, about 15 millimeters. Because you don't want this to look like goo coming out of there, which is really what it looks like. However, it is rendering just white right now versus water. If I go 1000% on stretch, which people might think is crazy, look what happens though. And now I can bring my radius back down to maybe about 7 millimeters. And just remember, in Modo, when you mouse over like this, it's going to focus the render in that area versus all over. It'll concentrate it. All right, so now 1000% might be a little too long, but you actually get that kind of sprayed splash look, right? Well, it still looks like milk or cream coming out of there, so let's do this. Let's save the scene. And from there, for the blob, we need to actually create material. So what I want to do is right-click on here, because if you look, there's no way to actually set a material color for that blob, right? So if you right-click on it, though, you can. You can create an item shader or an item mask. So we're going to create a mask. And what that does, puts a blob material right here in the shader tree. And with that, I can say, don't pick up any diffuse. Be specular a lot. Low roughness, so it's shinier. And then let's go over here to transmissive properties and 100% transparent. Let's give it a nice sort of typical blue color for the faucet. Might be a little too much, but that's okay. And let's give it 1.2 for refraction. And then let's just increase the absorption distance, which is a transparent thickness. So that color will vary just a bit. And let's keep that going. There we go. And let's let this render out. So now you can see the preview render. And we could probably increase the size of the blobs a bit, take down the stretch amount. But you can see how very easily you can put those particles in there. It interacts. We've got a nice little spray going. Now, a little trick is you can add two particles, two streams of particles. So one could be the flowy water. Then you have a very soft one that actually could act as a spray like this. So just kind of get clever with it. So I'm going to save the scene. You can load this up and tweak it on your own. Let's move on and do a little bit more with the particles and actually have them interact in a different way through a pipe versus outside of one.